The air in this bunker is thick, isn't it? Damp concrete and the lingering scent of stale coffee. We are kilometers beneath the surface, protected by meters of reinforced earth. Yet the enemy finds a way to penetrate the perimeter. Not the shelling above. That is merely noise, static in the high atmosphere, but the subtle corrosive pressure we feel here, in the dim light, to justify our every action, our every silence, our every strategic delay. This pressure is the most sophisticated form of psychological warfare ever deployed, and it originates entirely within our own ranks. We sit here perhaps contemplating the elegant brutality of the axiom, never complain, never explain. Let your results speak for themselves. It sounds simple, a clean, cold command, the kind of absolute certainty you crave in the 0 hour. Yet it sits like a live wire in the hand of the modern mind, threatening to burn us the moment we grasp it. We feel the urge, an intense, almost physical sickness, to rush out and clarify the nuance, to defend the intention, to manage the narrative of why we chose the difficult route over the easy consensus. We feel compelled to detail the obstacles we faced, the constraints under which we operated, the impossible variables we had to navigate. Why do we sacrifice the silence, the strategic advantage of the unknown, for the fleeting, saccharine comfort of being understood? This hunger for validation is not a moral failing. Do not mistake it for weakness of character alone. It is a tactical, operational error rooted deep in the oldest biological code, and understanding its origin is the first step toward neutralizing it. We are wired for the tribe. For the Paleolithic mind, explanation was survival. If you failed the hunt, if you returned empty-handed, you explained the weather, the terrain, the failure of the spear, the betrayal of the scouting party. You pleaded your case to the circle of fire, begging them not to cast you out. To be misunderstood was to be exiled, and exile meant certain death, a failure of the genetic imperative. That ancient primordial panic still surges in our bloodstream the moment our reputation is challenged, demanding that we deploy verbal defenses, rhetorical shields, to secure our social currency. The internal alarm system mistakes a critical email or a public dismissal for the shadow of the saber-toothed tiger preparing to pounce. In the modern theater, this impulse is amplified by the sheer volume of noise and the total lack of privacy. We are exposed. Every tactical maneuver, every failed reconnaissance mission, every minor miscalculation is instantly scrutinized by millions of observers, most of whom have risked nothing, shed no sweat, and possess zero operational context. The complaint is easy, the explanation is cheap, and both offer a microscopic dose of the purest psychological poison, dopamine. When we defend ourselves, we momentarily subdue the crippling anxiety of perceived inadequacy. We trade the hard, grinding work of enduring criticism for the quick fix of argumentative discharge. We treat explanation not as a strategic maneuver, which it can occasionally be under strictly controlled conditions, but as emotional triage, a palliative applied to our wounded ego, cognitive load. Every minute spent composing a justification, every emotional cycle dedicated to rehearsing a defense, is time and energy stolen directly from execution. The explanation is cognitive overhead. It is a tax levied by the insecure mind on the strategic operator. We must ruthlessly manage this budget. Do the generals spend their time clarifying their intentions to the kitchen staff? Do the snipers pause mid-target acquisition to detail their trajectory calculations to a civilian observer? Absolutely not. Every moment spent managing perception is a moment stolen from execution. Every word spent complaining about the difficulty of the mission is a drain on the operational tempo. We are commanded to hold the line, not to justify the architecture of the trench. The need to explain is simply the amygdala, screaming for tribal allegiance, mistaking external comfort for internal resolve. This is the first trap, believing that the clarity of our path depends on the agreement of the bystander. It does not. The true warrior understands that the results of the campaign must stand as their own impenetrable fortress, rendering verbal defense redundant and indeed insulting to the gravity of the work performed. We look back through the annals of war, seeking the archetype who wrestled with this exact discipline, the battle not just against the external enemy, but against the insidious internal demand for vindication. We turn not to the philosopher reading parchment in the quiet sanctuary, but to the man whose life was a series of lethal explanations delivered in steel. We speak, of course, of Miyamoto Musashi. Imagine Musashi past the peak of his legendary dueling career, having faced 60 opponents and never known defeat. His operational history was flawless, his reputation colossal, but his methods were chaos to the established samurai class. He was not an adherent of any recognized school. He was famously unwashed, often slept in the open, and refused formal service to any lord for extended periods. He was a force of nature, untamable, profoundly successful, and deeply misunderstood. The whispers followed him like shadows, heavier than any armor. They called him a brute, lacking refinement. They dismissed his unorthodox Niiten Ichiryu, the two-sword style, as a parlor trick, successful only through sheer animal ferocity, not true principle. The aristocratic warrior class, who prioritized the ritualistic presentation of the strike over the lethality of the outcome, found him offensive. They were the explanation class. Their rank depended on detailed genealogies and adherence to esoteric, formalized rituals that demanded constant verbal defense and explanation. Musashi was the execution class. His most famous victory, the duel against Sasaki Kojiro, slain with a wooden oar crafted on the trip to the island, was debated endlessly by those who survived only through political skill, not through combat. They claimed he arrived late as a deliberate psychological tactic, a form of disrespect. They claimed the wooden sword was somehow dishonorable. They claimed he won by luck or by the sheer size of his makeshift weapon. The rigid, politically suffocated warrior class could not fathom a genius whose only validation was victory itself. Divorced entirely from the established operational manual, they demanded nuance, context, and apology for his unconventional brilliance. We must see him, perhaps in his later years, retreating from the cacophony of courtly life and the endless political jockeying. He found a cave, Raigan-du, a cold, damp, unforgiving sanctuary where he would finally commit his knowledge to paper, producing the Book of Five Rings. The cave was not an escape, it was a final strategic consolidation. Outside, the world demanded he explain his life. Why the abandonment of the katana for the rustic life of a ronin? Why the refusal to settle down into the comfortable mediocrity of a stipend and a stable household? Why the total rejection of the existing military doctrine? The temptation, the psychological pressure to issue a grand defense, a manifesto detailing his superior insights, his moral clarity, his strategic genius, must have been immense. It would have been the easy path: articulate the brilliance, satisfy the critics, enjoy the subsequent applause, and validate the standards of the explanation class by engaging on their terms. But Musashi did not send emissaries with pamphlets. He sat in the cold silence, facing the stone wall. He knew that the moment he engaged the noise, the moment he attempted to manage the perception of the thousands who hadn't walked his path, who hadn't endured the lethal geometry of 60 duels, he ceded control of his own gravity. To explain was to enter their courtroom, to accept their flawed jurisdiction, and to acknowledge that their rules had merit. Instead, he worked. He sharpened his brush, and with the same unflinching economy he used with a blade, he laid out his strategy. He did not write a defense of his past. He wrote a blueprint for future mastery. His silence became the most devastating explanation of all. The proof was not in his words, but in the unassailable weight of his legacy, secured not by apologetic explanation, but by meticulous, disciplined action, crystallized into doctrine. He understood that when the results are monumental, the explanation becomes impertinent. The very necessity of the explanation diminishes the result itself. Musashi chose the solitude of the forge over the noise of the public square, because he realized that the elegance of explaining nothing is the absolute confidence that the trajectory of your life, once charted and executed, serves as its own final, irrefutable testimony. This is where we must introduce the concept of the mirror. The explanation class deals in rhetoric and rumor, in shifting narratives and temporary vindication. They can manipulate the immediate moment, twisting the interpretation of a victory, inflating the importance of a minor setback. But history, or rather, the consequence of sustained, lethal discipline, holds the mirror. The mirror is unforgiving. It reflects only the objective reality of the past. It records the trajectory of your entire life's output, ignoring all footnotes and justifications. Musashi knew that his success would not be judged by the temporary opinion of the shogun's court or the gossip of the local dojo masters. He would be judged by the mirror, the objective, clinical assessment of his operational effectiveness and the longevity of his strategic philosophy. If your foundation is weak, the mirror will show cracks, regardless of how elegantly you wallpapered over them with explanations. If your doctrine is lethal, the mirror will show 60 victories, regardless of how many critics claimed you cheated. Musashi refused to invest in defending the moment because he was playing a multi-generational game. He was investing in his reflection in the mirror. When we complain or explain, we are actively attempting to distort the mirror with rhetorical smoke. We are admitting that the facts themselves are insufficient to secure our position, and that we require verbal intervention to polish the image. The general who constantly explains his decisions in the heat of battle loses the trust of his troops, not because they doubt his intelligence, but because they doubt his self-assurance. They see a commander prioritizing his personal reputation management over the clear-headed focus on the objective. The silence, conversely, demonstrates an unwavering faith in the underlying quality of the action. It is the silent declaration, "The facts of the matter will suffice. I trust my own strategic map more than I fear your provisional judgment." Musashi's silent defiance is not merely a piece of warrior folklore. It is a clinical demonstration of stoic logic applied under hostile conditions. We must now take this historical scenario and dissect the mechanics of our own irrational impulse to explain, translating philosophy into tactical doctrine. Why does the modern soldier, when criticized, immediately reach for the rhetorical shield? Because we are attempting to achieve an outcome that is inherently outside the boundary of our control. This is the core strategic blunder, the catastrophic violation of the dichotomy of control. When we explain ourselves, we are attempting to manage the internal disposition of another human being, their judgment, their emotion, their prejudice, and their eventual verdict on our actions. We seek to compel them, through clever argumentation, to adopt our perspective. But their mind, their interpretation, their fundamental unwillingness to truly listen are external variables. They are the winds and the currents, impossible to command. They are outside our operational perimeter. The moment we invest emotional and intellectual capital in controlling these uncontrollable external elements, we condemn ourselves to immediate psychological defeat. We have chosen a point of engagement where we cannot win. If the explanation fails, and it often does, because bias is a wall impervious to logic, and people rarely listen to be convinced, but to reply, we suffer a double casualty. We lost time and energy explaining, and we lost the subsequent fight against the crushing frustration of being misunderstood. We doubled our exposure to external volatility, turning a single operational challenge into a psychological crisis. The Stoic knows that judgment is cheap currency. Your explanation does not change the objective truth of your actions, it only changes the context in which others view them. And since their context is their problem, our intervention is futile. We must cease to mistake the map for the territory. The territory is the hard reality of what we executed. The map is the public narrative, which is inherently flawed and secondary. Consider the concept of amor fati, the love of fate. This is not passive resignation. It is active acceptance of reality, including the reality of misunderstanding. If we are destined to be criticized for a strategy that we know deep in our operational core to be correct, then amor fati demands we embrace that criticism as part of the strategy itself. The friction must be accepted as the necessary resistance that sharpens our focus. We must stop seeing the misunderstanding as an error to be corrected and start viewing it as necessary tactical friction. It serves to filter the weak, to strengthen our resolve, and to ensure that only those committed to the gravity of the mission remain close. The noise of critics is the chaff that separates the true operators from the tourists. Furthermore, the need to explain often stems from a lack of faith in the integrity of our own initial judgment. If we are secure in the operational excellence of our maneuver, why would we require external affirmation? The explanation is often a subtle form of complaint, a plea for sympathy, a demand for recognition that the task was difficult. The explanation says, "I want you to know this was hard, therefore my standard should be lowered." The result says, "The difficulty was irrelevant. I won." The gap between those two statements is the distance between a commander and a victim. The elegance of explaining nothing is therefore a strategic weapon. It preserves our energy. It focuses our entire command structure on the task, not the narrative. It utilizes the silence as a mechanism of power, forcing the world to deal with the undeniable facts of our creation, not the mutable rhetoric of our intentions. When we stand firm, absorbing the noise without reaction, we demonstrate a profound and terrifying internal control. We signal that our allegiance is not to public opinion, but to the cold, hard logic of the objective. This is the wisdom. Explanation is a leak in the psychological armor, and the disciplined warrior plugs all leaks instantly. The silence is more than just the absence of speech. It is the accumulation of strategic weight. Every time we refuse to engage in the petty battle for explanation, we consolidate our authority. We force the world to interpret our actions, rather than having our actions dictated by external demands for justification. Strategic weight is gained by the consistent demonstration that our internal compass is the only necessary guide. When you speak only to command, to execute, or to inform the operational necessity. Never speak to justify. The time for theoretical analysis is over. We transition now from the diagnosis to the deployment. This is the protocol for active combat against the urge to defend and complain. Understand these steps are not suggestions. They are directives for operational survival in the modern environment, which we now treat as a continuous psychological engagement zone. The doctrine of unearned noise, defensive protocol. You must acknowledge that the vast majority of criticism and demand for explanation is unearned noise. It is the static generated by those who observe but do not act. When the impulse to explain hits you, that tightening in the chest, that sudden need for clarity, you must immediately run a tactical verification check. 1. Jurisdiction. Check. Does this criticism come from someone who has the explicit, earned right to command my focus or redirect my resources? Is this person responsible for the success or failure of my current objective? 2. Commitment check. Is this person in the arena bearing the scars of the same operational commitment? Are they currently executing at the same level of risk? 3. Utility check. Will explaining this action contribute, even tangentially, to the successful completion of the mission, or is it purely a mechanism for reducing my anxiety? If the answer to the first two is no, and the answer to the third is utility for emotional triage, the impulse must be treated as hostile fire that must be ignored. You must develop a mental firewall that treats the demand for explanation as a breach attempt on your internal resources. The moment you start internally rehearsing your defense, you have already lost the exchange. You have committed cognitive resources to a failed cause. Discipline your thoughts to dismiss unearned noise instantly, without emotional residue, returning instantly to the immediate priority of the mission. The silence is not merely lack of speech. It is a highly active state of deliberate non-engagement, the equivalent of a phased array radar locking onto the primary target while filtering out ground clutter. You are committed to the primary target only. The deployment of irrefutable result, offensive protocol. The only acceptable form of explanation is proof, delivered through sustained action. This is the only defense strategy that works in the mirror. Your strategic focus must shift entirely from narrative management to output density. You must make your operational tempo so demanding, your standards so high, and your production so undeniable that the question itself becomes absurd. You must internalize the understanding that effort is irrelevant, outcome is everything. The critics are not interested in the difficulty of your journey. They are interested in the structural integrity of your fortress. The elegance of explaining nothing is achieved only when the result is so monumental, so unassailable, that any preceding explanation would have been a trivial distraction. If you build a flawless bridge across a chasm, you do not need to explain why the initial foundation was difficult to pour, or why the engineers argued about the tensile strength calculations. The bridge stands, solid against the currents. The structure itself is the explanation. This requires an almost fanatical dedication to the craft, an unwavering commitment to quality over velocity, and an understanding that the work done in the dark, the relentless, unseen execution, is the only thing that matters when the light hits it. Your energy must be channeled into making the explanation obsolete, rendering it a historical footnote to an already established fact. Focus on the geometry of the task, not the geometry of the criticism. The result must be self-evident and overwhelmingly successful. Anything less justifies the request for an explanation. Therefore, demand perfection of your own output, because that is your shield, your weapon, and your ultimate command brief. The vigilance against emotional leakage, maintenance protocol. We must establish a system for perpetual maintenance because the enemy within is cunning. The most common form of explanation is the complaint. The complaint is emotional leakage. We complain when we are tired, when we are frustrated, when we want credit for the sheer difficulty of the struggle. This is fatal because complaining is explaining why the standard should be lowered for you. It is a strategic surrender of self-accountability. This protocol demands zero tolerance for leakage. If you feel the need to complain or defend, you must immediately redirect that kinetic energy back into the work itself. Transform the impulse to whine into the impulse to drill deeper, to analyze the failure, to increase the operational tempo. Instead of telling the world how hard it is, show the world how resilient you are. The difficulty is not a point of dialogue. It is the raw material from which excellence is forged. This requires daily self-inspection, a routine clearing of the decks. Every morning, identify the potential points of emotional failure, the areas where you feel slighted, overburdened, or misunderstood, and consciously commit them to the incinerator of indifference. These feelings are distractions. They are the enemy's fifth column within the perimeter. You are a commander now, not a victim. Commanders do not petition for sympathy. They demand execution. We operate under constant threat. The battlefield is relentless. You are not here to win popularity contests or to secure temporary approval ratings. You are here to execute the mission with lethal precision. Leave the weak comfort of justification to those who have time to waste and no consequence to fear. Our commitment is to the cold, hard currency of reality. The outcome is the only language that matters. The silence is your armor. The results are your voice. Now secure your post. Extinguish the desire for approval and let the sheer, uncompromising weight of your discipline deliver the only explanation the world deserves. Fall in line. Execute.